The evening sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge as Margaret Wilson drove home from her weekly veterans support group. Her hands, weathered by time and service, gripped the steering wheel of her old blue sedan. At 78, she still sat straight-backed, a habit from her days as an army nurse in Vietnam. The car's engine made a familiar rattling sound as she stopped at a red light. Margaret glanced at the dashboard where a small photo hung, her son in uniform, his face partly hidden by shadows. She smiled, thinking of their upcoming Sunday call. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror just 2 blocks from her small house. Margaret sighed, pulling over carefully. She knew why they'd stopped her. The broken taillight she hadn't fixed yet. Her pension check wouldn't arrive until next week. 2 young officers approached, one on each side of her car. Their badges caught the fading light. Officer Daniels and Officer Wilson, no relation to her, she thought wryly. License and registration, Daniels said sharply, not bothering with a greeting. His hand rested near his belt in a way that made Margaret uncomfortable. Margaret reached slowly for her glove compartment. "I know why you pulled me over, officers. The taillight. I'm getting it fixed next week when my pension comes in." Officer Wilson snorted. "Sure you are. Heard that one before." Margaret handed over her documents, including her veteran ID card. "I don't make excuses, young man. I served as a field nurse in Vietnam. I understand rules and responsibility." The officers exchanged glances, ignoring her service mention. "Do you know how dangerous a broken taillight is?" Daniels asked, talking slowly and loudly as if she couldn't hear properly. "Yes, officer, I do. Like I said." "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Wilson cut her off. Margaret's heart quickened. "Is that really necessary? I'm just heading home." "Now please," Daniels insisted. The evening air felt cool as Margaret carefully got out, her left knee stiff from an old injury. She stood tall despite her small frame, meeting their eyes directly. They made her wait while they inspected her car thoroughly, checking everything they could. Nearby, a neighbor walking his dog slowed down, watching with concern. Margaret gave him a small moan to show she was okay. "Your car has multiple violations," Wilson finally said, writing on his ticket pad. "Broken taillight, cracked windshield, and your registration sticker is peeling." "The windshield just happened yesterday," Margaret explained. "A truck kicked up a rock on the highway. And I suppose that's getting fixed next week too?" Daniel smirked. Margaret took a deep breath. "Yes, officer. I live on a fixed income. I have to budget for repairs." "Rules apply to everyone," Wilson said, tearing off a ticket. "Even veterans." The way he said veterans made Margaret's stomach tighten. She'd heard that tone before, from people who never understood what service meant. "That'll be $275, Daniels said, handing her the ticket. "Get those fixes done immediately or next time it'll be worse." Margaret looked at the amount, calculating quickly. That was nearly half her food budget for the month. "This seems excessive for a first offense," she said quietly. "Most folks around here get warnings." "Well, you got a ticket instead," Wilson said. "Consider yourself special." As they walked back to their patrol car, Daniels muttered something about entitled veterans always expecting special treatment. He said it just loud enough for her to hear. Margaret stood by her car until they drove away. Her hands trembled slightly as she got back in, but she refused to let tears form. She'd kept her composure in field hospitals during mortar attacks. She wouldn't break down over 2 disrespectful young men with badges. At home, Margaret placed the ticket on her kitchen table next to a framed photo of her son in his dress uniform. James' smile looked back at her. The same smile she'd seen when he was a boy, though his eyes had changed over the years. "Nothing to worry about," she told the empty room, making herself believe it. But as she prepared her simple dinner, she kept thinking about Sunday's call with James. For the first time in years, she considered not telling him everything. Her son had enough to worry about wherever he was, doing whatever dangerous work he did. Little did she know, a mother's slight change in voice would be enough to set powerful forces in motion. Monday morning arrived with a sense of purpose. James woke early, put on a crisp button-down shirt and dress pants, and drove to the Pine Ridge Police Department. He walked in with the confidence of a man who had faced far worse than small-town politics. "I'd like to speak with Chief Bryant, please," he told the desk sergeant. "Do you have an appointment?" The sergeant barely looked up from his computer. "No. Please tell him Colonel James Wilson would like a few minutes of his time. I'm Margaret Wilson's son." The name recognition was immediate. The sergeant's head snapped up and he reached for the phone. 10 minutes later, James sat across from Police Chief Bryant, a stocky man with thinning hair and a permanent frown. The chief's office was filled with award plaques and photographs of him shaking hands with various officials. "What can I do for you, Colonel?" Bryant asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm concerned about some policing patterns I've observed since coming home," James said evenly, "specifically regarding treatment of elderly residents and veterans." Bryant leaned back in his chair. "We enforce the law equally for everyone. The ticketing data suggests otherwise." James placed a folder on the desk. Public records show a 340% increase in citations issued to residents over 65 in the past 8 months. Vehicles with veteran plates are ticketed at twice the rate of other vehicles. Care to explain? The chief's face reddened. "Where did you get these numbers?" "Public information. I'm good with data, Chief Bryant, and patterns." James opened the folder, revealing neatly organized charts and statistics. "I'm also concerned about Officers Daniels and Wilson. Their conduct toward my mother and other elderly veterans has been unprofessional at best." "They're good officers following my directives," Bryant said defensively. "Your directives include harassing Korean War veterans at the farmers' market. Interesting leadership approach." The men stared at each other across the desk. James remained perfectly still, maintaining the calm intensity that had broken hardened enemies in interrogation rooms around the world. "What exactly do you want, Colonel?" Bryant finally asked. "3 things. First, a review of your department's ticketing and enforcement practices. Second, a formal community meeting where elderly residents and veterans can voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Third, Officers Daniels and Wilson to complete sensitivity training regarding treatment of veterans." Bryant laughed. "And why would I do any of that?" James smiled slightly. "Because the alternative is me taking this folder, plus additional information I've gathered, to the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and several media contacts who owe me favors." He placed a second, thicker folder on the desk. "This one contains evidence of selective enforcement, potential civil rights violations, and what appears to be coordination between your department and Mayor Pavison's development plans. I'm sure you recognize how that might look to outside investigators." The chief's face had gone from red to pale. "You're threatening me." "I'm offering you a choice," James corrected. "Fix the problem internally, or have external forces fix it for you. I prefer the first option, less messy." Bryant studied him silently. "You're not what I expected from Margaret Wilson's son." "People often make that mistake." James stood. "I'll give you until Friday to decide. That's more courtesy than your officers showed my mother." As he turned to leave, Bryant called after him. "You don't want to make enemies here, Colonel. You're just passing through. We'll still be here when you're gone." James paused at the door. "Chief, I've made enemies on 6 continents, people who actually knew how to fight. I'm not concerned about adding Pine Ridge to the list." His voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "But for everyone's sake, I hope that won't be necessary." The chief's secretary watched wide-eyed as James walked out. By noon, word had spread through the department about the confrontation. James's next stop was Town Hall, where he requested a meeting with Mayor Patterson. The mayor's assistant tried to schedule him for next month, but James simply took a seat in the waiting area. "I'll wait," he said pleasantly. "I have all day." An hour later, the mayor's door opened, and several men in business suits filed out. They glanced curiously at James as they passed. "The mayor can give you 5 minutes," the assistant said stiffly. Mayor Patterson was younger than James had expected, barely 40, with an expensive haircut and a politician's smile. His office was twice the size of the police chief's, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the town square. "Colonel Wilson," he said, gesturing to a chair without rising from his desk. "What brings a military man to my office?" James sat down, taking in the framed development plans on the wall, luxury condos where the old community center currently stood. I'm concerned about how your administration is treating veterans and elderly residents, James said directly, including my mother. The mayor's smile never wavered. We'd value all our citizens, Colonel. Pine Ridge is simply moving forward with the times. Progress requires change. Progress shouldn't require intimidation, James countered, or selective enforcement of laws targeted at specific demographics. Strong accusations, Patterson said, his smile cooling. Do you have evidence? Enough to warrant a state investigation, James replied calmly. But I'd prefer to resolve this locally. The mayor glanced at his watch. I appreciate your concerns, but I have another meeting. Perhaps you could put your thoughts in writing for our next town council meeting? First Tuesday of next month. James didn't move. I've already met with Chief Bryant. He's considering policy changes to address these issues. I thought you'd want to be part of the solution. Something flickered in the mayor's eyes, surprise, perhaps concern. What exactly did Bryant say? That's between him and me, James replied. But I'll be addressing the town council this week, not next month. I believe emergency sessions can be called with the support of 3 council members. I already have 4. The mayor's smile disappeared entirely. You've been busy for someone who just arrived in town. I'm efficient, James said, and motivated. Patterson stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Well, Colonel, I look forward to hearing your concerns at the council meeting, though I think you'll find most citizens support our vision for Pine Ridge's future. James rose as well. We'll see. One question before I go. How much did Thompson Creek Development contribute to your last campaign? Was it $50,000 or $75,000? The mayor froze. That information wasn't in any public record James could have accessed. I don't recall the exact figure, Patterson said carefully. Don't worry. I have it in my notes. James walked to the door, then turned back. One more thing, those luxury condos you're planning for the community center property. My mother and her friends will be staying in their homes. You might want to revise your plans. He left the mayor standing speechless behind his desk. That evening, James joined his mother's veterans group at their weekly meeting. The small hall was packed. Word had spread about his confrontations with the chief and mayor. What happened? Frank Rivera asked eagerly when James walked in. I opened a dialogue, James replied, accepting a cup of coffee from his mother. That's a fancy way of saying you scared the daylights out of them, Bill Thompson chuckled. The point isn't to scare anyone, James said seriously. It's to restore balance. They need to remember who built this town and who they're supposed to serve. As the meeting progressed, James outlined the next steps. The emergency town council meeting. The evidence they'd present. The changes they'd demand. What if they refuse? Someone asked. Then we escalate, James said simply. But they won't refuse. Margaret watched her son with a mixture of pride and concern. In his calm voice and confident stance, she recognized the leader he had become. But she also saw the strategist calculating every move, the warrior preparing for battle if diplomacy failed. As the meeting ended, she pulled him aside. Promise me you won't go too far, James. He looked down at her, his expression softening. This isn't a war, Mom. Just a readjustment of boundaries. Trust me. Margaret nodded. She did trust him. But she also knew her son well enough to recognize the look in his eyes. Pine Ridge's power players had no idea what kind of force they had awakened. And tomorrow would bring the reckoning. The Pine Ridge Town Council chamber had never been so packed. People stood along the walls, sat in extra chairs brought from nearby offices, and crowded in the doorway. Word had spread quickly about the emergency meeting, bringing out residents of all ages, though the elderly and veterans were front and center. James arrived early with his mother. Margaret wore her old army nurse pin on her blouse, a small silver caduceus that caught the light as she moved. Many other veterans wore similar tokens of their service, pins, caps, or jackets that identified which branch and war they had served in. Nervous? Margaret asked as they took their seats in the front row. James smiled. I've briefed presidents before high-stakes missions, Mom. This is just a town council. Presidents don't hold grudges like small-town politicians, she warned. True, but they also don't have Delta Force colonels as their neighbors' sons. Mayor Patterson entered with the 5 council members, all looking uncomfortable at the size of the crowd. Chief Bryant slipped in shortly after, taking a seat near the back, his face tight with tension. Officers Daniels and Wilson stood by the door, arms crossed defensively. The meeting began with standard formalities, but the mayor quickly acknowledged the elephant in the room. "I understand Colonel Wilson has some concerns to address," he said, gesturing toward James. "We've agreed to hear him out as a courtesy to a visiting member of our armed forces." James walked to the podium, carrying a single folder. The room fell silent. In his simple dark suit and white shirt, he looked more like a businessman than a soldier, but the way he carried himself, straight-backed, completely confident, revealed his military background. "Thank you, Mayor Patterson, council members." His voice was calm and clear. "I'm here because Pine Ridge has a problem. Over the past year, this town's leadership has systematically targeted its elderly residents and veterans through selective enforcement of regulations, excessive ticketing, intimidation, and financial pressure." Mayor Patterson shifted uncomfortably as James placed several documents on the overhead projector. Charts and statistics appeared on the screen, showing the dramatic increase in citations against elderly drivers and homeowners. "These numbers tell a troubling story," James continued. "A story of a town turning against the very people who built it. The question is why." He clicked to the next slide. A map of Pine Ridge appeared, with certain neighborhoods highlighted. These highlighted areas show where property values would increase most dramatically if current residents, primarily elderly and veterans on fixed incomes, were to sell and move out. Coincidentally, these are the same neighborhoods facing the highest rate of citations, the steepest property tax assessments, and the most aggressive police presence. The crowd murmured as connections became clear. James kept his tone matter-of-fact, never accusatory, simply presenting evidence. "I'd like to propose some solutions," he said, looking directly at each council member. "First, a comprehensive review of all ticketing and enforcement practices from the past year. Second, establishment of a community oversight committee with representation from elderly residents and veterans. Third, a review of recent property tax assessments in the highlighted neighborhoods." Mayor Patterson cleared his throat. "While these concerns are noted, Colonel, I'm not sure they warrant the dramatic action you're suggesting." James nodded, as if expecting this response. "I understand your position, Mayor, which is why I've prepared additional information." He pulled out his phone and read from a text message. "I have confirmation that the State Attorney General's office is very interested in reviewing these findings, particularly the connection between targeted enforcement and your administration's relationship with Thompson Creek development." The mayor's face went pale. "Additionally," James continued, "I've been informed that several journalists would be interested in profiling Pine Ridge as a case study in how development interests can corrupt small-town governance. They've reserved space in Sunday's state newspaper, pending our discussion today." The council chamber erupted in whispers. One council member leaned over to whisper urgently to the mayor. "However," James said, raising his hand for quiet, "I believe Pine Ridge can solve its own problems. That's why I'm here, not to threaten, but to help restore balance." An elderly woman in the audience stood up shakily. "My name is Dorothy Miller. I've lived in this town for 62 years. My husband died serving this country. Last month, I got 3 tickets in 1 week for yard violations I've never had before. Is that what Pine Ridge has become?" Others began to stand, sharing similar stories. The momentum built as more residents spoke up, not just elderly people and veterans, but younger citizens troubled by what they were hearing. Chief Bryant finally stood. "Mayor, with your permission, I'd like to address the issues regarding law enforcement." The mayor gestured reluctantly for him to continue. "After reviewing the data Colonel Wilson presented earlier this week, I've concluded that changes are needed in our departmental policies." Bryant looked uncomfortable but determined. "Effective immediately, I'm ordering a review of all citations issued in the past year. Officers Daniels and Wilson will be reassigned to training duties pending this review." The 2 officers by the door stiffened in surprise but said nothing. "Furthermore," Bryant continued, "I'm establishing a community liaison position focused on improving relations between our department and all segments of our population, particularly our veterans." A wave of approving murmurs swept through the crowd. James caught his mother's eye. She was smiling proudly. The meeting continued for another hour. One by one, the council members voiced support for addressing the issues raised. Even Mayor Patterson, seeing which way the wind was blowing, pledged to review the development plans and ensure they served all residents. By the end, concrete steps had been agreed upon. A community oversight committee would be formed. The ticketing policies would be revamped. A town hall meeting would be held monthly to address ongoing concerns. As people filed out afterward, many stopped to thank James. Veterans clasped his hand firmly. Elderly residents patted his arm or squeezed his shoulder. But it was his mother's quiet, "well done" that meant the most. Outside, as twilight settled over Pine Ridge, Chief Bryant approached them. "You could have ruined me, Colonel," he said bluntly. "Why didn't you?" "Because you're not the problem," James replied. "You just forgot who you're supposed to serve. Now you remember." The chief nodded slowly. "How long are you in town?" "Another week, then I have to get back." "Will things slide backward when you leave?" James glanced at his mother, standing tall among her friends. "No. These people don't need me to fight for them. They just needed to remember how to fight for themselves." As promised, James stayed one more week. He helped establish the Oversight Committee with his mother as its chairperson. He attended meetings with the police department to review their new community-oriented policies. He even had coffee with Mayor Patterson, discussing how development could proceed while respecting the town's existing residents. The morning of his departure came too quickly. Margaret drove him to the small regional airport, both quiet with the weight of goodbye. "I've left you in a bit of a spotlight," James said as they parked. "Are you sure you're okay with that?" Margaret laughed. "Son, I ran a field hospital in Vietnam. I can handle a town council. Besides, I've got a whole army of friends now." At the terminal, she hugged him tightly. "You did good, James, real good." "I learned from the best," he replied, kissing her cheek. "Call me if there's any trouble." "There won't be." She straightened his collar, a mother's eternal gesture. They know better now. 6 months later, James received a package at his forward operating base. Inside was a Pine Ridge newspaper with the headline, "Community Oversight Committee Celebrates Successful First 6 Months," alongside a photo of his mother cutting a ribbon at the newly renovated Veterans Hall. There was also a letter, written in his mother's neat handwriting. She told him about the changes in town, how the police department now held monthly coffee meetings with senior citizens, how the development plans had been modified to include affordable housing for veterans, how Officers Daniels and Wilson had actually become advocates for the new approach after completing their training. She ended the letter. "Sometimes the strongest force for change isn't the one that makes the most noise, but the one that knows exactly where to apply pressure. You taught me that, James. Or maybe I taught you. Either way, Pine Ridge is whole again. Your father would be proud. I know I am. Love, Mom." James folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket, close to his heart. In a world where his missions would never make headlines and his victories would never be publicly celebrated, this was one outcome he could hold on to. A small town remembering its values. A mother standing tall again. Justice restored without a shot fired. Sometimes, he thought, those were the greatest victories of all. Half a world away, Colonel James Wilson crouched in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, 6 of America's most elite soldiers checked their gear in silence. The air smelled of dust and distant smoke. A mission clock counted down on his specialized watch. 15 minutes until go time. "Ghost, satellite feed is clear," whispered his communications specialist, using the nickname James had carried for 20 years. No one called him Colonel Wilson in the field. To enemies and allies alike, he was simply Ghost, a legend who appeared and disappeared like a shadow, leaving changed worlds in his wake. James nodded, studying the tablet showing thermal images of the compound they would enter. 24 heat signatures inside. 3 hostages in the northeast corner. Their intelligence had better be right. Lives depended on it. At 52, James was older than most active field commanders. Silver streaked his close-cropped hair, and fine lines marked the corners of his eyes. But no one had ever suggested he step back from operations. His body remained as honed as his tactical mind, both shaped by decades of the world's most dangerous work. 3 minutes, he said softly. His team members gave thumbs-up signals. What happened next would never appear in any official report or news story. The operation lasted exactly 12 minutes. No shots fired, no alarms triggered. 3 hostages rescued, 8 workers who had been missing for months. The team vanished like they'd never been there, leaving behind only confusion among the captors who couldn't understand how their prisoners had disappeared from a locked room. Hours later, as their helicopter approached the forward operating base, James checked his watch. Sunday. In America, it would be evening soon, time for his weekly call with his mother. He never missed it, no matter what mission he was on. His team knew about the tradition and respected it. Some even envied the connection he maintained despite his dangerous life. Back at base, James showered away the mission's dust and changed into clean fatigues. His small private quarters held few personal items, just a weathered photo of his mother in her Vietnam-era nurse uniform, and one of them together at his academy graduation. He'd been so young then, eager to follow in her footsteps of service, though he'd chosen a different path. James sat on his bunk and opened his secure satellite phone. The connection took a moment to establish, bouncing through multiple secure servers to hide his location. Then it rang, the familiar tone abridged of his other life, the one where he wasn't Ghost, just Margaret Wilson's son. She answered on the 3rd ring. "James, is that you?" "Hey, Mom, right on time." He smiled, leaning back against the wall. "How's your week been?" He listened as she talked about her garden, the veterans group meeting, her neighbor's new grandchild, normal life in Pine Ridge. But something in her voice caught his attention, a slight hesitation, a change in rhythm when she mentioned driving home the other day. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked, interrupting her story about church activities. "Of course, dear." The pause was too long. "Just the usual. You know how it is." James sat up straighter. In 30 years of military service, he'd interrogated terrorists and negotiated with warlords. He knew when someone was holding something back, even his own mother. "Mom." His voice softened but grew more focused. "What happened?" Another pause, then a sigh. "It's nothing, James, just a traffic ticket, broken taillight. I'm getting it fixed next week." "That's not what's bothering you." "Tell me." The dam broke. His mother told him about the officers, their tone, the excessive fine, the comment about entitled veterans. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, less protecting him, more sharing a frustration she needed to express. James listened without interrupting, his face growing still in the way that made junior officers nervous. When she finished, he asked a few questions: officer names, badge numbers, time of day. Details locked into his memory with photographic precision. "It's nothing to worry about," Margaret said. "Please don't fuss. You have important things to deal with." James looked at the mission report, waiting for his signature. 3 lives saved today. Important work, yes, but his mother's dignity, that was important too. "I'm due for some leave," he said casually. "Been a while since I've been home." "James Wilson, don't you dare come all this way because of some rude policeman." "Actually," he said, "the decision already made. I've been meaning to fix that loose step on your porch, and the gutters probably need cleaning before winter." His mother laughed, the sound lightening something in his chest. "You're stubborn, just like your father was." "Wonder where I got that from," he teased. "I'll try to fly out Wednesday, make up the guest room." After they hung up, James sat motionless for several minutes. Then he opened his laptop and began typing a leave request. In 20 years, he'd never asked for emergency personal time. His commander would approve it without question. When Ghost needed something, he got it. In the mess hall later, his team noticed the change in him, a certain focus, different from mission readiness. "Everything good, boss?" asked his second-in-command. James nodded, drinking his coffee. "Fine. Taking some leave. Family matters." The team exchanged glances but asked no questions. They'd follow him into any battle without hesitation, but they knew better than to pry into the personal life of a man who guarded his privacy as fiercely as he protected his country. As he packed his civilian clothes that night, James wondered what exactly he planned to do in Pine Ridge. He wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing: no one disrespected his mother. Not in the town she called home for 40 years. Not while her son still breathed. The deadliest man in Delta Force was coming home. and Pine Ridge had no idea what was about to hit it. James Wilson stepped off the small regional plane onto the tarmac of Pine Ridge County Airport. The facility was hardly more than a single runway with a modest terminal building, but it was just 20 minutes from his mother's house. He wore jeans, work boots, and a plain black jacket, civilian clothes that felt strange after months in uniform. A duffel bag over his shoulder held everything he needed for 2 weeks. The rental car was basic, a mid-sized sedan, nothing like the armored vehicles and helicopters he typically used. As he drove the familiar roads toward his childhood home, James rolled down the window. Pine Ridge smelled like it always had: pine trees, freshly cut grass, and the distant scent of the lake. Some things never changed, even when everything else did. Margaret Wilson was waiting on the porch when he pulled into the driveway. She looked smaller than he remembered, but her smile was the same. James felt the familiar tug in his chest, the guilt of being gone too long, mixed with the relief of seeing her well. "You didn't need to come all this way," she scolded as she hugged him tight. "I told you it was nothing." "Nothing, huh?" James smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I haven't taken leave in 3 years, Mom. The military was about to force me to take a vacation anyway." Inside, the house was exactly as he remembered: clean, modest, filled with memories. Photos lined the walls. James in his academy uniform, his father in his old army gear, Margaret in her nurse's uniform from Vietnam. A close-knit family of 3, now down to 2. Margaret had prepared pot roast, his favorite. As they ate dinner, she talked about the neighborhood, her friends from church, the veterans group she still led every Tuesday. Normal life, the kind James protected but rarely experienced. "Now tell me honestly," she said finally, refilling his coffee cup. "Why are you really here? You've never taken emergency leave before. Not even when your father passed." James set down his fork. "I heard something in your voice, Mom. Something wasn't right." "It was just a traffic ticket," she insisted, but her eyes dropped to her plate. "It wasn't the ticket. It was how they treated you." James kept his voice gentle. "Has it happened before?" Margaret sighed, then nodded slowly. "Not those particular officers, but yes, attitudes have changed in town, especially toward older folks and veterans." "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Margaret shared stories she'd kept from their phone calls. How the new police chief had brought in young officers from outside who didn't understand the town's history or respect its older residents. How several of her friends from the veterans group had similar experiences: excessive tickets, condescending treatment, even intimidation. How the town council meetings had grown hostile when concerns were raised. Phil Henderson, you remember him, he owned the hardware store. He tried speaking up at a council meeting. The next day, his delivery truck was pulled over 3 times for inspections. He got the message and stayed quiet after that. James listened, asking occasional questions. His face remained neutral, but inside, his tactical mind was already forming connections, identifying patterns and developing options. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked finally. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "You have real problems to solve, James, not small-town politics. Nothing that affects you is small to me." Later that evening, as Margaret went to bed, James sat on the porch swing, thinking. A police car drove slowly past the house, the officer inside studying him with obvious interest. James met his gaze calmly, nodding in greeting. The officer didn't nod back. The next morning, James rose early and fixed the loose step on the porch. Then he cleaned the gutters as promised. By noon, he repaired the leaky faucet in the bathroom and replaced 2 burned-out light fixtures. Margaret watched him work with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "You're avoiding something," she said as they ate lunch. "You always fix things when you're planning something." James smiled. "Just being useful, Mom." After lunch, he borrowed her car to pick up some supplies. The broken taillight was his first stop, fixed properly at the local auto shop. Then he drove downtown, parking across from the police station. For 30 minutes he sat quietly, watching officers come and go, observing patterns, habits, routines. When he returned home, Margaret was in the backyard, tending her garden. James paused at the gate, watching her. She hummed softly while working, the same lullaby she'd sung to him as a child. But when a police siren sounded in the distance, her shoulders tensed instantly. She glanced nervously toward the road, her hands trembling slightly. That small movement, that instinctive fear, settled something in James's mind. His mother, who had once treated wounded soldiers under enemy fire without flinching, now startled at the sound of a local police siren. The woman who had taught him about courage and standing up for what's right was now afraid in her own hometown. That night, after Margaret went to bed, James sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. He wrote down names, connections, patterns, creating the framework of a plan. Not a military operation with tactical objectives, but something more personal. A way to restore balance to a town that had lost its way. Tomorrow, he would begin reconnaissance. Proper intelligence gathering was the foundation of any successful mission, and while Pine Ridge wasn't a combat zone, James approached it with the same methodical precision he would use for any operation. One thing was certain, he hadn't fought in 3 wars and led America's most elite soldiers just to watch his mother live in fear of bullies with badges. Whatever was happening in Pine Ridge was about to change. The deadliest Delta Force commander in history wasn't just home for a visit. He was home with a purpose. The next morning, James left the house before dawn. He wore running clothes and moved at an easy pace through the sleeping town. To anyone watching, he was just a man getting exercise. In reality, he was mapping Pine Ridge with a soldier's eye. He ran past the police station, the town hall, the homes of officers Daniels and Wilson. He noted security cameras, patrol patterns, shift changes. The habits of a town were like the habits of any target, predictable once you knew where to look. After his run, James stopped at Dottie's Diner for breakfast. The place hadn't changed in 20 years. Same red vinyl booths, same coffee smell, same photos of local high school teams on the walls. Dottie herself, now in her 70s, still worked the counter. "James Wilson, as I live and breathe," she called when he walked in. "Margaret said you were home, but I didn't believe it." James smiled, taking a seat at the counter. "Good to see you, Dottie. Still take your eggs over easy with extra bacon. Some things never change." As he ate, James listened to the morning chatter. Small towns ran on gossip, and Dottie's was information central. He learned that Officer Daniels was the police chief's nephew. That Officer Wilson had been hired 6 months ago after leaving a department in the city under unclear circumstances. That the mayor's re-election campaign was funded largely by money from a new development project on the edge of town. "Town's changing," Dottie said quietly as she refilled his coffee. "Not all for the better. Glad your mom's got you home for a bit. Anything specific I should know about?" Dottie looked around before leaning closer. "Watch yourself with those new officers. They don't much care for veterans or old-timers. Your mom's both." James nodded. "Thanks for the warning." After breakfast, he walked to the town library. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Chen, had known him since he was a boy checking out adventure books. She seemed unsurprised to see him requesting town council minutes and public records. "Research for your mother?" she asked, helping him navigate the archives. "Something like that." For 3 hours, James read methodically through public documents. He found patterns hidden in plain sight. Property taxes rising in areas where older residents lived on fixed incomes. Traffic enforcement concentrated in certain neighborhoods. A subtle push to make life uncomfortable for longtime residents while courting new development. When he left the library, James drove to the Veterans Hall where his mother held her weekly meetings. The building was small but well-maintained, a point of pride for local veterans. Inside, he found Bill Thompson, his father's old army buddy, arranging chairs for the next meeting. "James, your mom said you were in town." Bill's handshake was still firm despite his age. "What brings a busy Delta man home?" "Just checking on Mom. Heard there's been some trouble with the police." Bill's smile faded. "More than trouble. It's a pattern. Systematic, I'd say." They sat at a folding table, and Bill shared more stories. Veterans being pulled over repeatedly. Tickets for minor infractions that were previously ignored. Older veterans intimidated into silence when they tried to raise concerns. "It started after Chief Hodges retired," Bill explained. "New chief, new mayor, new priorities. Old folks like us, especially veterans who ask questions, we are not part of their vision for Pine Ridge. Has anyone filed formal complaints?" Bill laughed without humor. "With who? Police department investigates itself. Town council's in the mayor's pocket. County sheriff won't interfere with local jurisdiction. James nodded, making mental notes. What about Mr. Lee at the newspaper? Paper got bought out last year. New owner's the mayor's brother-in-law. The pieces were fitting together. Not a conspiracy exactly, just small-town politics and power at its worst. A gradual pushing aside of those deemed inconvenient to progress. As James drove back through town, he noticed a police car in his rearview mirror. It followed him for several blocks before turning on its lights. James pulled over calmly, rolling down his window as Officer Daniels approached. License and registration, Daniels said, not bothering with a greeting. James provided the documents wordlessly. You're Margaret Wilson's son. It wasn't a question. That's right. Daniels studied his driver's license. Military ID says Colonel. That's impressive. Just a job, James replied evenly. Was I speeding, officer? Taillight looks a little dim. Daniels smacked. Just being thorough. James nodded. I appreciate thorough police work. It's important. Something in his tone made Daniels look more closely at him. There was a stillness to James that experienced people recognized as dangerous. Consider this a courtesy check, Daniels said, handing back the documents. Welcome back to Pine Ridge, Colonel. Thank you. I'm sure we'll see each other again. After dinner that evening, James sat with his mother on the porch. She rocked quietly in her chair, watching the sunset paint the sky pink and orange. You've been busy today, she observed. Just getting reacquainted with town. And? James smiled. His mother had always been perceptive, and I think I understand what's happening. Can to share with the class. He told her what he'd learned, the connections between the mayor, the police chief, and the development plans. The systematic pressure on older residents and veterans. It's about money and power, Mom. Always is. They want to reshape Pine Ridge, and people like you are in the way. Margaret sighed. We suspected as much at the veterans group. But what can we do? We're just old folks against the system. James reached over and took her hand. Systems can be changed, Mom. I've done it before. Not with violence, she said sharply, knowing her son. No, he agreed, with intelligence, planning, strategy, the right pressure at the right points. Margaret studied him, seeing both the boy she'd raised and the man he'd become. What exactly are you planning, James? He smiled. First, I need more information. Tomorrow, I'm going to visit some friends of yours from the veterans group. Then I might pay a visit to Town Hall. And then? Then we see if Pine Ridge remembers what justice looks like. Later that night, James made a few phone calls using a secure line. Old contacts, people who owed him favors. By morning, he would have background checks on every key player in town. By afternoon, he would know their weaknesses and pressure points. This wasn't a battlefield in some far-off country, but in many ways, the mission was the same: protect the innocent, expose corruption, restore balance. Pine Ridge was about to learn that sometimes justice comes from unexpected places, and Margaret Wilson's son was just getting started. The weekend brought Pine Ridge's monthly farmers market, where local folks gathered to sell produce, crafts, and homemade goods. James walked beside his mother as she greeted friends and neighbors. He noticed how many of them were elderly, how deeply rooted they were in this community. Mrs. Wilson, good to see you, called a gray-haired man selling honey jars. And this must be your son we've heard about. Tom, meet James. James, this is Tom Parker. Best honey in 3 counties. James shook the man's hand, noting the navy tattoo on his forearm. Pleasure to meet you, sir. As they continued through the market, James observed how people treated his mother with respect and genuine affection. These were her people. This was her home. The thought of her being afraid here bothered him more than any battlefield danger he faced. Near the center of the market, a crowd had gathered. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair was arguing with Officers Daniels and Wilson. I've had this spot for 15 years, the old man was saying. My permit is valid through December. New regulations, Officer Wilson said, tapping a clipboard. Your permit doesn't meet current requirements. James felt his mother tense beside him. That's Frank Rivera, she whispered. Korean war vet. Sells wooden toys he carves himself. The crowd murmured unhappily but kept their distance from the officers. James noticed several older residents backing away, eyes downcast. "Let's get a closer look," James said quietly. They moved through the crowd until they stood near the front. Frank Rivera's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. His table of hand-carved toys, trains, cars, and animals was being taken apart by Officer Daniels. "You can't just change the rules without notice," Frank insisted. "I paid for this permit." "File a complaint if you want," Officer Wilson said with a smirk. "Now clear out before we cite you for obstruction." James felt his mother's hand grip his arm, a silent plea for restraint. He patted her hand reassuringly and stepped forward. "Excuse me, officers," he said in a calm, conversational tone. "What seems to be the problem?" Both officers turned, their expressions changing when they recognized him. Daniels straightened slightly, while Wilson's smirk faltered. "This is police business, sir," Daniels said. "Please step back." "Of course, I'm just curious about these new regulations. When were they passed?" "I'd like to see a copy, if possible." Officer Wilson frowned. "They're internal department policies, not public record." "Interesting," James said, pulling out his phone. "Because according to the town charter, all vendor regulations must be approved by the town council in a public meeting and posted 30 days before enforcement." He held up his screen, showing the relevant section of municipal code. "Perhaps I misunderstood." People in the crowd began to whisper. Someone was filming with their phone. "Look," Daniels said, lowering his voice, "we're just doing our job. Take it up with the chief if you have a problem." "I intend to," James replied pleasantly. "But in the meantime, since there's been no public notice of any regulatory changes, Mr. Rivera's existing permit should remain valid. Wouldn't you agree?" The officers exchanged glances. The crowd had grown, and more people were watching. Officer Wilson finally shrugged. "Fine, he can stay today, but he needs to update his paperwork by next week." As they walked away, Frank looked up at James. "Thank you, son. You know your way around regulations." James helped him reset his table. "Military teaches you to know the rules before you break them, or enforce them." Word spread quickly through the market about what had happened. As James and his mother continued shopping, people nodded respectfully or whispered thanks. Several older veterans approached to introduce themselves. "Your boy handled that real smooth, Margaret," said one elderly woman selling quilts. "Didn't raise his voice once, but those officers knew they'd met their match." Margaret smiled proudly. "He's always been good at solving problems." On their way home, they stopped at the grocery store. In the parking lot, they witnessed Officers Daniels and Wilson ticketing a car with veteran plates. "That's Dr. Howard's car," Margaret said. "He volunteers at the VA clinic every Wednesday." James watched as the elderly doctor approached his car, arms full of groceries. The doctor's face fell when he saw the ticket. The officers walked away laughing. "Wait here, Mum," James said. He approached the doctor first, helping him with his groceries. Then he walked over to the officers, who were sitting in their patrol car. "Officers," he called, "quick question." Daniels rolled down his window reluctantly. "What now, Colonel?" "Just wondering why Dr. Howard got a ticket while those 3 cars," James pointed to nearby vehicles, "are also parked at an angle but didn't receive citations." "We can't catch everyone," Wilson said dismissively. "Of course not. But it's interesting that you consistently catch vehicles with veteran plates or driven by elderly residents, almost like you're targeting them specifically." "That's a serious accusation," Daniels said, his voice hardening. "It is," James agreed. "One that would be easy to disprove with your ticketing records. Public information, of course." "Are you threatening us?" Wilson asked. James smiled. The kind of smile that had made hardened fighters in hostile territories cooperate without resistance. "Not at all. Just making an observation about patterns. Interesting things, patterns. They tell stories." He tapped the roof of their car lightly. "You gentlemen have a good day. I'm sure we'll talk again soon." As he walked back to his mother, James heard the patrol car start up and drive away quickly. "What did you say to them?" Margaret asked. "Just making conversation, learning their personalities." That evening, they attended a small gathering at Bill Thompson's house. A dozen elderly veterans and their spouses sat in the living room, sharing stories of recent run-ins with local authorities. "It's not just the police," said a former Army nurse named Helen. Property tax assessments are targeting our neighborhoods. Water rates are higher on our side of town. It's systematic. James listened carefully, asking occasional questions. These people had served their country, built this town, played by the rules. Now the rules were being used against them. "What can we do?" asked Frank from the farmer's market. "Nobody listens to old folks anymore." James stood up. "You're looking at this wrong. You're not just old folks. You're organized veterans with skills, knowledge, and a lifetime of experience. The mayor and his friends see you as obstacles. I see you as a force." The room grew quiet as James outlined what he had learned about the connections between the mayor, the police chief, and the developers. He explained how the systematic pressure on veterans and elderly residents was designed to encourage them to move out or stay silent. "They want you scared," he said. "Scared people don't fight back. But I've never met a veteran who stayed scared for long." By the time the meeting ended, a plan was forming. Not a battle plan, but a strategy for change. Phone trees were organized, research tasks assigned, each person left with a purpose, standing taller than when they arrived. As James and Margaret walked home under the stars, she squeezed his arm. "You gave them hope tonight. That's a powerful gift." "Hope is just the beginning," James replied. "Tomorrow, we start changing things." He meant it. Tomorrow would bring the first real confrontation. And Pine Ridge was about to learn what happened when you pushed too far against people who had spent their lives refusing to back down.